So can pressure work politically? Well, we know because Donald Trump did it to Republicans. Now imagine if you did that.
You want to bully our senators?
Yes, I do.
That's
Absolutely.
what you want to do.
Hi. If you question the two-party system, chances are you've had a million arguments just like this. The truth is the public is hungry for a politics that puts people before profits. They're just not sure how to get there. It's our job to make that case. My name is Harper. I studied rhetoric and debated competitively for 4 years. And today, we're going to break down this Jubilee conversation and see what it can teach us about effective communication. By the end of this video, you'll have the frameworks you need to think about political conversations on a deeper level so that you can win people over and start making change in the real world. Let's get into it.
I can't. The voters are sick of I can't.
It's not
Why
I
don't
can't.
you actually try?
It's more
so
difficult.
tell me why they're such losers. They can't pass paid family leave at 84%.
Are
they losers or do they actually secretly agree with the Republicans and they don't want any of this because they're corporate donors?
I agree with you on policy. I want paid family leave. I want single-payer health care. But this is not like super easy to pass. You're like, if they just all hold their hands and
I can get it passed in 2 weeks.
We're going to get like
2
single-payer.
weeks.
So even though I'm sympathetic to Chank's position, I think there is a fundamental flaw with how he's choosing to communicate here. See if you can spot it.
Minimum wage, we at the Young Turks fought for Bernie to put it back in and at least get a vote. Okay, it got a vote. And guess what happened? The 8 Democratic senators who were pretending to be in favor of it all of a sudden voted with the Republicans. They had more than enough to block it because the Democrats don't mean it. They always do rotating villains. So, brother, at what point are you going to say the failure is on purpose and not, golly gee, they're the Washington Generals against the Harlem Globetrotters?
When you have slim majorities, paradigm-shifting policy is just harder to pass.
But 60 is not a slim majority.
So what's actually going on here? First, Adam justifies lackluster Democratic performance by pointing out that they were under some sort of constraint. Then Chank responds by asserting that they didn't fight hard enough to overcome the constraint because they didn't intend to in the first place. This pattern plays out continuously in this debate. Accusation, justification, accusation, justification.
How can we do public option instead over 70%?
We had 50-50 split Senate with guys like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema.
You know how you do it, brother? You know how you do it by trying.
Yep, they try. They try every day.
No, but literally
You're not on the inside. No, you don't know.
I think it's super important to understand why this pattern keeps repeating itself, because this sort of conversation by definition could never make progress. The reason that these debates and conversations are so unproductive, and I'm sure that you've had 1 or 2 of these in your day, as I have as well, is because Chank and his opponents are both approaching the debate from entirely different frames. The frames of game denial versus game acceptance. So what do I mean here, right? What are these frames? How do we identify them? And how do we actually synthesize them and bring them together so that we can stop talking past each other and start having dialogue that's actually productive? Before we get into that, we need to make sure that we have our facts straight, because all the rhetorical finesse in the world won't save you if you don't know what you're talking about in a political conversation. How do we stay informed without reading the news for 5 hours a day? I'll show you the method I use. First, go to Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. It's an app and a website. I'm on the website right now. So Ground News processes thousands of articles every day and merges them together. That way you can see a story from every single angle. They don't pretend to be unbiased. They just aggregate all the news for you so that you can quickly get an overview of who's covering a story and how they're covering it. So how do we actually use this tool to prepare for political discussions? Well, first you got to head over to their blind spot feed. This is basically going to let you see which stories are being covered by each side so that you can quickly understand what the other side is talking about and what your side is missing. As you can imagine, this story about ICE pulling back in Minneapolis is being covered very differently by the left than it is by the right. Plus, thanks to their ownership tracker, you can see who's funding any given publication. As you can see here, I'm able to get an exact breakdown of each outlet covering this story and whether it's independent or corporate. Because if you want to understand the news, you got to understand who's paying for it. I love Ground News. I've used it for years, ever since I was a competitive debater and needed to stay informed for my extemporaneous speaking event. I truly believe it's the smartest way to monitor the news, and I want you to try it for yourself. I managed to get you guys 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan. That brings the cost down to just $5 a month. Go to groundnews.com/Harper or scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description and the pinned comment to support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. Okay, so what's actually going on in this debate? Like I said, Cenk and his opponents can never see eye to eye because they are operating with completely different paradigms. The game denial paradigm and the game acceptance paradigm. So what's the difference between these worldviews and how do they manifest? Well, Cenk's opponents are coming at the discussion from the position of game acceptance. In their view, there are many places in the political process where even well-meaning politicians are going to face constraint or at the very least need to navigate a very complex machine. Therefore, if you want to change things, in their view, your best bet is to learn the rules of the game and play it well. Or more accurately, to put your faith in experienced political operators like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries who know how to play the game strategically. If you've ever had a political conversation and kind of got the vibe of like, oh, you don't understand, these things are complicated, that's not how politics works, sort of thing, then you're probably talking to a game acceptor. Cenk, on the other hand, is entering the discussion from the position of game denial. In his view, all this talk about process and constraint is essentially just a disingenuous attempt to carry water for a party that has no desire to deliver for its voters. And so, therefore, if you want to change things, your best bet is to call out this shell game, reject it, and just refuse to play. Now, you may have noticed that one of these lines of thinking resonated more with you. If you're more progressive, leftist, whatever, you probably tend to think that these process arguments are lame and that they're justifications for failure, essentially. In other words, you have a bias towards game denial. I would put myself in this category, by the way. On the other hand, if you're more of a party loyalist, you tend to see an ambitious agenda as risky, as idealistic, as ignoring trade-offs. In other words, you have a bias towards game acceptance. But here's the thing that I really want to underscore. Neither one of these perspectives are inherently right and wrong. In fact, they're both true in their own ways, but limited in their own ways simultaneously. So how is this possible? Right? The fact of the matter is, Democrats, or any political party for that matter, may genuinely be trying to achieve certain objectives, but they're trying to achieve these objectives within the constraints of the game. Game deniers and game acceptors acknowledge one side of this equation and reject the other, which is exactly why this debate that you're seeing between Cenk and these establishment types out of deadlock.
They represent their people.
No,
Joe
they
Manchin
don't.
represents
No, they
his
don't.
people.
They-
They sent him there. How do you know that?
Okay,
You're not from West Virginia.
Okay, hold on.
Everybody involved is arguing past each other. They're approaching the discussion from at completely different levels, from completely separate paradigms. So how do we synthesize these positions and transcend this dichotomy? We do it by understanding the concept of game change. Simply put, game change is the productive synthesis of game denial and game acceptance. On one hand, you accept that life, or in this case politics, is a game. And on the other hand, you also intentionally work to evolve that game so that it can have better outcomes. In the context of this conversation, that looks like acknowledging the constraints that politicians are working under while also intentionally trying to recalibrate those constraints and incentives so that more populist outcomes become realistic or even inevitable. Now, if this is all kind of still seeming vague, no worries. I'm going to explain in detail. This is the critical thing you got to realize about game change mentality. It avoids the limitations of both game denial and game acceptance. Game acceptors have a hard time understanding that what's realistic is socially defined, and that the boundaries of acceptable thought, the horizon of the possible, and the constellations of power can and do get redrawn constantly. You'll notice this if you talk to political staffers like I have, people who like literally work on Capitol Hill. These are generally intelligent, genuine people who sincerely believe that they're doing good. And yet they tend to have an incredibly limited political imagination because they're thinking from inside the game. In fact, they've internalized the game to such an extent that its logic becomes practically as unchallengeable and universal as the law of gravity for them. Thankfully, game change overcomes this blind spot by forcing us to engage with the world as it could be, not merely with the world as it is. On the other hand, game deniers have a hard time thinking about their politics in terms of what's realistic. Even that word, realistic, leaves a bad taste in their mouth. If you've spent time with political radicals like I have, you'll notice that they tend to make moral arguments for their politics, and they tend to be pretty maximalist with their demands. And the reason for this is that they can afford to be maximalists. They can afford to make moral arguments rather than practical arguments because they reject the game. And so their thinking is not bound by the logic of the game. They are outsiders. They are dissidents. And so they never need to contend with power as anything other than something to be opposed. Game deniers tend to resist considering trade-offs. They have a hard time thinking about how their positions will be received by people who don't already agree with them. And they don't really like to acknowledge constraints. But once again, game change overcomes this blind spot because it forces us to engage with the world as it is, not merely with the world as it could be. In short, game acceptance neglects potentiality, while game denial neglects actuality. Only game change allows us to see the full picture, that politics is both a struggle to win the game and a struggle to define the rules of the game. All right, so let's bring this conversation down to earth a little bit. How can the game denial, game acceptance, game change model help us communicate better in political conversations like this Jubilee debate? Well, once we internalize the game change worldview, we have a much more nuanced understanding of the dynamic that Shank and his counterparts are arguing about. So when Shank blames corrupt politicians, is he right or is he wrong? Well, he's not wrong to point out that the political game is rigged, but he is wrong to say that politicians are simply lying about their goals. I mean, they might be sometimes, but the problem goes much deeper than that. The truth is, from a game change perspective, the situation is not just about feckless politicians betraying their voters and choosing to do nothing. It's that these structures are designed to impede popular energy, which means that even a well-intentioned politician could spend decades in the legislature and never really win big for the people. Because in many ways, the game of liberal democracy isn't set up for the people. Okay, so now that we understand this, we have the tools that we need to decode, in my opinion, the most interesting conflict in this video.
Hi, how you doing, sir?
Good. How you doing?
I work in Republican politics. One of the first jobs I took was in a small district, but it was in Lucas County, Ohio, and it was a poor district. And I was representing a Republican. When my candidate would go and we'd be knocking doors together talking about how he wanted to improve their lives, is he an anomaly?
Hey,
Good to meet you.
Good to meet you, brother.
All right, so I'm glad you clarified already. You're talking about Republican politicians. And you brought up donor money, and I know that's a big issue with you. But I think that's just not really how it works. I think you have a lot of politicians that start off, as you said, kind of in those lower levels. They do an office here, they do a job here, and then they slowly rise up. And if you can track their views, you see that their views don't actually really change a whole lot over time. When the donor money comes in, it's not like they suddenly change their views and they're a completely new person. They've had the views that they've had for a very, very long time. So how can you sit here, Shank, and look in your crystal ball and say, oh, I know I can look into the souls of Republicans and say, oh, well, they're not actually genuine in some of these proposals.
Yes.
So now that we can actually understand the perspectives that everyone in this conversation is operating from, it becomes a lot easier to understand this dispute in detail. From Micah and Todd's perspective, it seems incredibly obvious that there are tons of genuine politicians out there who are trying to deliver for their constituents in a complicated and often hostile political environment, and that Cenk's perspective is needlessly reductive and cynical. On the other hand, from Cenk's perspective, it seems incredibly obvious that politicians are influenced by special interest, and that Micah and Todd's perspective is naive and power-serving. So how do we synthesize these perspectives? What's the game change position here? Well, to answer that, let's look at another clip. This one comes from linguist and political writer Noam Chomsky. Chomsky had recently released his book, Manufacturing Consent, which explores how media manipulation functions in the West. According to Chomsky, capitalist nations have no need for direct censorship or state control of media because the logic of for-profit media conglomerates incentivizes the promotion of narratives that serve moneyed interests and the suppression of those that challenge moneyed interests. So the system sort of works automatically. There's no censor required. Journalists naturally self-censor in this sort of dynamic system. It's a really interesting read. You should check it out. I promise I'll bring this all back to the Jubilee video. Work with me here, people. So in this clip, Chomsky is being interviewed by a journalist who is understandably touchy about the assertion that he is essentially a professional propagandist. Let's watch the exchange, and then I'll explain how it's relevant to this Jubilee conversation and the game denial, game acceptance, game change model more broadly.
I'm just interested in this because I was brought up, like a lot of people, probably post the Watergate film and so on, to believe that journalism was a crusading craft and that there were a lot of disputatious, stroppy, difficult people in journalism. And I have to say, I think I know some of them.
I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're
journalists
self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
That line, if you believed anything different, you wouldn't be sitting here, is so crucial for understanding the logic of institutions and the game change mentality. So what's going on here? Essentially, Chomsky is pointing out that people don't need to be individually dishonest to participate in a corrupt system. In fact, the system only works, in this case, if a majority of the people participating in it think they're doing so for justifiable reasons. And this applies to politicians as well as journalists. Sure, some politicians might be corrupt SOBs and know that they are corrupt SOBs, but the vast majority of them have simply found a way of justifying taking money from AIPAC or the oil lobby or whoever else has the ability to grease their wheels, so to speak. Because the institution of Congress just selects for people who can justify serving moneyed interests. Anyone who can't or won't do that will quickly find themselves isolated and disillusioned and out of a job. In short, the office selects the office holder, not the other way around. So why does all this matter? Again, it comes back to game change. If we want to actually transform things for the better, the solution is to understand the rules of the power game and then continuously work to change them. Putting pressure on elected officials is part of that, sure, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. Which begs the question, how do we rewrite the rules of the game? How do we change the playing field? Well, in a populist context, this has historically meant two very simple things. Number one, a strong labor movement, and number two, a strong labor party. If you watch my channel, you've probably seen me harp on this more times than you can count, but I think it's super important to understand, so I'm going to do it anyway. So let's get into the why and the how. People forget this, I think, but the New Deal, which today is viewed as sort of the high watermark of American progressivism, was actually a compromise between the Roosevelt administration and the demands of a much more radical, militant, organized trade union movement. I'll give you another example. The robust social safety net enjoyed by many Europeans today only exists because of the efforts of organized labor and the dominance of labor parties, not to mention the threat of actual revolution. So if you've ever wondered despairingly whether the people have any chance of taking on the political and economic establishment, the answer historically is yes, absolutely we do, but only if we organize. And I want to emphasize, even the process-oriented establishment types get to have their cake and eat it too, because shifting the balance of power through organized labor changes the calculus of what's, quote unquote, realistic. Before the neoliberal turn in the 70s and 80s, cutting taxes on the wealthy and big business, deregulating or gutting social programs would have been seen as unrealistic by establishment politicians and business leaders even. These are people who, regardless of party, largely bought into the dominant Keynesian economic paradigm. Just to illustrate how changing the paradigm can sort of shift the playing field, let's watch this clip.
Good enough, good enough. I'll take my 5% change. Thank you, sir. May I have another, sir? So please, for God's sake, wake up and unite to actually get economic policies that we love. The whole country wants.
You can say
except
that,
those corrupt politicians.
In West Virginia, Kamala Harris lost by 30 points, okay? If you put someone that is to the left of Kamala Harris on any economic issue, they're going to lose by that same margin.
You're totally wrong.
No disrespect, but this statement is pretty crazy to anybody with even a cursory understanding of West Virginia's history. And I think Cenk does a pretty good job of catching it. Because the reality is Democrats used to own West Virginia precisely because they were seen as the party of the working class and a state with a long history of labor struggles. I mean, look up the Battle of Blair Mountain. A lot of people don't know this, but the first time that bombs were dropped from airplanes was not in World War I. It was against striking miners in West Virginia. So this line of thinking that West Virginia, of all places, would not be amenable to economic populism is a perfect example of game acceptance in action. Because Shane is only looking at the game as it currently is, where America is largely polarized along cultural lines rather than class lines. And within this paradigm, rural white people are basically inherently right-wing. And so the only way to win them over from that perspective is to present yourself as a diet Republican. In my opinion, this is not a winning strategy. We'd be better off shifting the playing field entirely. So rather than trying to convince centrists that universal health care or fill in the blank on your preferred progressive policy is a good idea intellectually, we can also just make it this centrist position. The game has changed before, and we can change it again. In closing, I just want to say, our society needs to transform radically if we are going to advance justice, if we are going to bring human civilization to the next level, if we are going to meet the challenges of the 21st century head on. That's why I'm on the left. But we are never going to achieve those priorities if we treat political conversations as a chance to virtue signal rather than to win people over. If you want to join me on this mission, you can subscribe and watch this video where I break down a debate between entrepreneur turned podcaster Patrick Bet-David and 25 anti-capitalists. Until next time, a better world is possible.